Welcome back, artists. I'm Wyatt Paints, and this week, I'm doing Superman again. I know, 3 times in a year is a lot, but the Blue Boy Scout is a popular figure. So when this week's sponsor SuperShark let me know they had a statue of Clark that had more edge than a razor belly milkshake, I said sign me up, and boy did they deliver. This is a monster of a project that's going to require us to dig deep in our tool belt for all the help we can get to bring this statue to life. Heck, I even have to pull out the airbrush for this one. And since this has taken so much extra effort, I figured I'd show you guys a little bit more of the process starting from right after the cure. If you enjoy getting this extra bit, be sure to let me know in the comments. And since we're talking about comments, I want to take a quick moment to shamelessly ask for support and ask for you to like, comment, and subscribe on this video because I'm inching my way up to 2,000 subs, but I can't get there without viewers like you. With that said, I have everything set up and ready to go. So meet me over at the prep table. I'm going to grab my brushes. Let's get started. Sitting down with the raw parts, the first step needs to be cleaning up the remaining supports hidden around the model. Having a metal file for this makes it pretty fast work. Just be extra thorough, as any of these little greebles hanging on will be frustrating to deal with once we start painting. And it would be a very good idea to wear safety goggles to protect your peepers. Just one stray support springing into your cornea will end your hobby day fast. The base has a deep seam from the base cut, which is unavoidable printing at this size, while the bat signal here ended up with a touch of warping, which is also pretty common with these large pieces. Thankfully here, we only need to concern ourselves with the seams on the sides, as the top is going to be covered up with the lens and the bat signal, so lucky us. And really, after some basic gluing, the seams shouldn't be too bad, especially with all that damage to camouflage. Gluing them up is pretty straightforward. Apply the glue, assemble, and wait. But when it comes to the signal, applying a good amount of pressure will help narrow the gap and shorten the work that'll be needed later. While the glue cures, it's a good time to start sanding all the support marks that are visible. And I do just mean the visible ones, as there's no point in sanding anything that won't be seen or affect the fit. Where it is needed, each area got at least 2 passes. First an 80 grit and then another in 200 grit to smooth it down. Any of the high visible areas got a 3rd pass with 600 grit, like these cables. It's not exciting, but this sanding and dry fitting is super important for the final look. This is when you can adjust and fix any issues without your paint job being at risk. Like how this section of cable got misprinted. Rather than having to print it over, I'm just going to clip it a bit short and bingo bango, no one will know. One other fix that was needed was on his cape. I was a little bit too aggressive removing it from the supports and had a bit of breakage. But with a steady hand and a key eye for alignment, it was mostly fixed. Just a bit of sanding and soon enough, we'll be the only ones to ever know about this little oopsie. Another important detail to look out for are these micro supports. They can pop up when you have these tiny little hangovers that your slicer program just sneaks a support into. Like on the legs here. Take care of them now before they leave blemishes on your finished model. Altogether, this part of the process takes me about as long as painting does, but I can tell you from experience, nothing kills the buzz of nearing the end of a project like finding a little nubbling support mocking you for your short-sightedness. Don't let it happen to you. Check, then double check, and dry fit, dry fit, dry fit. Now back to those seams. On the base, we can ignore the part that's underneath the signal and focus on the areas that can be seen. And seeing how wide this gap is, I'm choosing to use Tamiya putty. It's my go-to filler that gives me some options when it comes to the finish. And here, I'm gonna need it. Thankfully, the sculptor made the cut a bit jagged, so we can almost camouflage it as an extra crack in the street. But first, it needs an initial filling of putty to give it a base to start from. While I often will use my fingers, this is a very complicated surface that needs some somewhat straight edges, so using a silicone shaping tool will help tons. Once you get the first fill in, put it aside to dry. In the meantime, the signal seemed like it had a little bit of leeway, and I wanted to work with the smallest gap I can. So, some more super glue followed by as much compression as I can manage to close it up. And you might notice this little bit of blue right there. Let that be a reminder why I always wear gloves when I'm using super glue like this. Be careful. That would have really sucked if it was skin. Moving back to the ground because the putty was dry, I was contemplating leaving it as is, as it looked pretty good, but I wanted to add a bit more of an uneven edge to the crack and hide it a little bit more. So I added another layer of putty, this time using the edge of my tool to fudge the boundaries of the line a little bit more. Just be sure to clean the putty out of the ground texture with a bit of IPA. Going back to the signal, this is going to be the front side just behind Clark, so we're going to need to put some extra work here if anywhere, while the back side has this extra cooling block to help hide the break. The real issue would be the large gaps in the brass ring around the top, and because they're so big, I want to first put in a bit of scaffolding. This is just a few chunks of a calibration print I had lying around. A sliver for each side is plenty to build from. With that in place, I can use resin in a dropper bottle to slowly fill in the void, one layer at a time. If you do this, you want to go slow. If you put too thick of a layer of resin, it won't cure properly and you risk it oozing out later. It's better to be safe than fast here. Now that the gap is filled, it's time to sand this as flush as I can. And yeah, I can see I didn't get the seam perfect, and that's okay. Poe body's nerfing, but I still want to just push forward as there's going to be a lot going on, but I still want to minimize it as much as I can. And again, I get to ignore the seam along the top and the bottom, along with the seam that goes between the cooling fins. It won't really be that visible deep in there. Once these dry up, I'll hit them with a prime coat and meet you over at the painting table. Checking our seam, it looks pretty invisible on the back, and the front one did get enough jaggedness to blend in with the other crack. Mission accomplished. First up, rough iron. On bases like this, I like to start with the metallics to get them out of the way early, usually because it's the messiest thing to paint. So slapping these down to base the I-beams should go fast and furious. Then I pulled out True Copper to brighten up the details. And of course, Big Floof steps in to keep it from going too fast or too furious, and only catch the details while ignoring the recess areas. Just keep the dry brush light and it should be easy to tell when you need to move on to a different section. And for a peak highlight, True Brass. I'm only looking for a touch of this to kiss the details, so slowing it down to judge each stroke is helpful. Once you have a handle with how fast it's coming off your brush, you can then gradually pick up your speed. But if you go too fast, you could Tokyo drift right off course. Keep an eye out for it. This feels pretty good. Let's move on. With Deep Gray. It's the usual all-over base for the rocks. No deep thoughts here, just avoid the I-beams and you should be good. Time for a highlight with uniform. I went with a medium dry brush here to give definition to all the rock formations. This is what's going to cut those rocks from the gray background. And with Big Floof doing most of the work, it's pretty easy going for me. But I do need to pay attention so I know when I need to hit the brakes. Finally, a touch of ash gray. As per usual with a peak highlight, this step needs to be very reserved. So rather than fast and furious 5-time swiping, I opted for single deliberate strokes towards the bottom to give some directionality to the lighting. Null and oil break. For this, I'm looking for it to settle in the top texture of the asphalt and darken it down. Thinking back, I probably could have been more efficient just painting this a darker gray, but it seemed the way. It was just a bit of a long out of the way kind of way, as it took about 4 applications to get the tone I liked. Not bad for the start of the base, it just needs this extra prop metal. To switch things up, I grabbed a bit of gunmetal for some super fast dry brush metal. There, done. Now let's take a look at that bat signal. And try not to be intimidated. While it looks super complicated to paint, that couldn't be further from the truth. To get me going, I'm using a medium heavy dry brush of gunmetal on the center body. Don't worry about pushing this color into every nook and cranny. The black showing through will just add to the weathered and dark look. The key takeaway here is to keep it smooth and thin. For a little extra something, I grabbed true brass again. And just like the I-beams, I gave the metal a super light dusting to put a bit of discoloration on all the raised damage areas. It's very subtle, but I feel it makes the damage read better. So maybe it's just a me thing. Next up, weapon bronze. As you may have guessed, this is going to be for the retention rings at the top and bottom. And don't forget the cooling block on the back. Just keep it a very simple medium dry brush. This is where I noticed the gap at the bottom was a little bit wider than I hoped, but thankfully it's on the underside and would take a whole lot of doing to see. So I ignored it and kept on going. And sometimes that's what you have to do to get a project done. Otherwise you'll be stuck in limbo chasing perfection. But as a side note, take notice that the top 2 flanges on the upper ring should be bronze and the third bottom one should be gunmetal. It's a little detail that can either help sell the piece or hinder it. Now, I did have a bit of an overpaint. It happens sometimes when you rely on a fast 8 layers of dry brushing, but no biggie. Just a quick touch up of thinned down gunmetal and it'll be just fine. While I was here, I decided the raised lips could use a little bit of a boost, so they got a featherlight dry brush of metal medium just so they don't get lost in the shuffle. Moving up to the top, once again, I'm not concerned with the surface or the seam in the middle, but I still want to paint in here or else the bat emblem will be invisible. Now typically these spotlights have a mirrored interior to reflect out as much light as possible, so it made sense to toss down a simple bright silver base and call it a day. Next, True Brass got back on my brush to start picking out little bits and bobs around the light, like these end caps and all the nuts and bolts around holding the thing together. Using slightly different tones of metal helped the model feel more intricate, grounded, and real. Just be consistent. Once you paint one bolt this color, you're committing to do them all this color. Thankfully, it only takes a dab of paint on each. A tiny bit of extra work for a whole lot of extra detail. Now with the extra detail, the metals are looking the part. Let's get night sky and jump on those cables. This can go pretty fast. Just double check what is and isn't a cable. And don't be like me and miss a cable. I literally noticed this just now as I wrote this. What a burn. Thankfully, it's on the underside of the lower half of the model, but it's still a gut punch to realize a mistake so publicly. Here's hoping I only have to learn this lesson once. To highlight, Griffin Blue. Then down a touch for a bit more transparency, I applied this towards the center of each cable to add a touch of depth. And silver lining, this job is a little easier if you forget to paint all the cables. Man, I just can't unsee it now. Anyways, let's move on to other details so I can hide my shame. Like this shattered piece of glass. There's a few ways we can do this, but I do want to point out that we could have just printed this in clear resin and then added shade to the cracks, but most people only run one printer and don't swap resins often, so I wanted to paint one up as simple as I could. Strangely enough, the easiest way to handle it is to treat it kinda like a rock. So let's base it up in deep gray first. And we want this base super smooth and super consistent. So make sure you have a damp brush every time you reload. Now, with a little bit of uniform gray on my palette, I switched to a bigger brush to stipple in the highlight towards the center. First beginning with a mix of the two colors, then gradually transitioning into pure uniform. Then I repeated this process with ash gray. Finally, a floofy dry brush of Spaceship Exterior to crisp up those edges. After this, I'll need to give this a heavy gloss varnish to prep it for the next step. And as you can see, unfortunately, the gloss varnish made me aware of some slight warping on my print. Thankfully, this is a ruined spotlight, so it should fit right in. Next up, oil stains. And this is why I use gloss varnish, as we can treat this kind of like an oil paint wash, just without the oil paint. The idea here is that the gloss varnish makes it a super smooth surface for the wash to flow into the cracks, but then be easily cleaned off the top surface with a Q-tip, leaving the crack nice and dark. Just keep a light touch during cleaning, as too much pressure will push the cotton into the crack, cleaning it out. And be sure to use perpendicular strokes. After a bit of practice, you'll be cruising through these cracks in no time. But say if there were some areas that the oil stain was stubborn to come off, like here. A touch of IPA comes in handy. Just don't use any more than to dampen the Q-tip and zero pressure. The heavy gloss varnish should be strong enough to protect your work. Finally, I wanted to re-establish that crisp edge I had with a final dry brush, a Spaceship Exterior. For the bat sign itself, I glued down a piece of calibration print just to raise it up a touch. It'll mostly go unnoticed, but it's kind of important to me. And be sure to align the Bat Emblem with the 2 coiled cables on the sides. Now, I could just leave this simple black and that'd be fine, but that would just be silly. And I love me an excuse to use Muso black. Just remember, don't use this paint to become a ninja. There's really not much to say about this step. It's painting black on black, but it still looks cool as hell. At this point, I showed it to a friend of mine, and his response?
It's good. I'm missing something though.
Best feedback ever. So I decided that something would be a lot of weathering, starting with some dirty down rust. Now, I like to plan out where and how I'm going to weather something, and it's just as important here, as different metals age differently. And in addition, this was made to be outside, so I'm going to restrict the rust to places where 2 different metals touch. Once the plan is set, time to work fast and toss that rust on. Don't try to overthink it and just slop it on where it needs to go. This stuff wants to go on thick, and it's best when it dries uneven. So don't waste time trying to make those boundaries look natural. We'll adjust them in the next step. And remember, you don't want this in the damaged areas. The damage is new. Any rust there would have been knocked off and vaporized. So only think of weathering it as it would have been before the action started. Next up, sepia shade. This is what I'm going to use to blend and diffuse those rust edges. Granted, I could just use water, but using a shade will allow it to blend a whole lot easier. Just a few soft jabs and stipples is all it takes to reactivate the rust and get a nice jagged feathered looking edge. Just work your way around the light, adjusting all the rust spots you find. Time for some verdigris, but not straight from the bottle. I want this super thin. And be aware, this should only go on the copper parts. But other than that, you could put it just a few touches wherever you'd like. After giving plenty of time to dry, the metals were looking quite old, but the patina was a touch too much for my liking and needed to be pulled back. So, introducing my newest brush, Biggest Floof, and it's going to help me get the lightest dry brush possible of weapon bronze over those areas that I added the verdigris. This will catch on all the edges and temper its appearance. Then, to further meld the layers, a quick stipple of sepia really put a bow on it. When you add a bit of the colors you used in earlier layers on top of everything, you subtly play a trick on the eyes as they can't tell what was painted last, thus making it look less painted and more real. Put together, it was looking quite impressive, but some of the damaged areas were getting lost, so I added a bit of that Muso black in the scorch marks. I'm not looking to fully block it in, just tracing out the line that I imagine his laser beams took, and using a bit of a stipple will help feather off the edge. Now I needed some general all over grime, so I grabbed Nuln Oil and tossed it into a spray bottle. At just the right distance, you can get a nice splatter of tiny speckling. After our drying session, the bat signal was looking better than pretty good, but now the base needed to get upgraded to match. Thankfully, it was just a matter of repeating all the weathering steps on the I-beams. And not to forget the rocks, I pulled out these dry pigments I picked up last time I was at Michael's. A quick few touches of sand dust in these tight pockets on the rocks, and I should be good. And what the heck, let's get Biggest Floop back in here to knock off the excess pigment. The base is done, but before we move on to Clark, I'd like to take a few moments to thank my subscribers over on Patreon. As the months roll by, seeing these names of greatness gives me the motivation I need to keep chugging on. Everything you see is either stuff I already have, provided by our generous sponsors, or by amazing viewers, just like you. So if you would like to join the Painting Pantheon, you'll find a link to that below. And I can't talk about support without mentioning this week's sponsor, SuperShark. They provided this week's STL, and as per usual, they supplied a banger. As you've already noticed, it's dripping with details. If you want to get your hands on this and many other top quality STLs, be sure to check out their link below. Heck, you might just find your next project. For now, I can hear Superman doing some super brooding. Let's get him painted. And we're back to getting work on the main body. Unlike a typical super suit, this one is not cloth. It's more of an organic steel, and that, my fellow artists, is my wheelhouse. To get me going, Nightmare Black. Now, truth be told, this is not black. It's just a very, very, very dark blue. I want this to be the base shadow. And I know, it's not a metallic, but you just gotta trust the process sometimes. Just focus on getting a perfectly smooth and even base to work from. Here comes that metal with cobalt. Now, this might be a little bit lighter and less blue than I want for the final look, but you gotta start somewhere. Just focus on slowly building this up on each muscle. Having a bright light near you will help guide you where you want to place this. Just paint the shine. Easy as that. Be sure to fit the arms and legs into place to ensure continuity of this highlight. Like here, a few seconds is all it takes to save yourself a big headache later. There, much better. Now to blue up the metal with Elven Armor. And once again, it's Biggest Floof coming in clutch for the third time in its debut episode. Way to make a splash, Biggest Floof. Putting a super thin layer on uses the cobalt as an undercoat that provides the brightness. Once I got everything tinted, I took him to the spray booth for a few coats of gloss varnish. With the varnish dry, Clark needs to get masked up for his next step. Using a bit of painter's masking tape gives a bit of safety. But with all the varnish I used, I'm pretty sure duct tape would have been fine. The torso was easy enough with a lot of straight lines, but what about those arms and legs? Well, then it's time for liquid mask. Now, I'm told you can thin this down to allow you to clean it from a brush, but I have found that not to be the case, so I always use a disposable brush. Please take heed of this warning. You'll want to use this to fill in the irregular border. You'll know it's dry when it turns transparent, but keep in mind this is a temporary mask. You don't want to leave this on for more than a few hours. Don't ask me how I know this, I just know. While I let the mask dry for far too long, let's take care of the cape. Usually, I do my capes on the dark and broody side, but most reference pictures I have of Absolute Superman feature a bold and striking cape, so I figured I'd give it a go. By first, basing in Wyvern Fury. Be sure to get full coverage in all the folds. Follow that up with Pure Red. Having Pure Red as the midtone seems most appropriate for a vibrant cape, but I want to control how much it creeps into the folds. This will be hard to see at first, but as the color starts to build, you'll become more aware of it. You just gotta be patient. Finally, Blood Chalice. And you know the drill. If Big Floof is here, that means we want light dry brushes. So check your paint loads before touching the model after every reload, while also restricting to dusting only the peaks of the folds. And don't ignore the inside of the cape. It doesn't need to be painted to a showroom quality, but be sure to give the outside thirds of the inner cape the full treatment. And before you put this down, give the entire outline a solid crisp edging. You might get a touch overspill, but that's just the fate of the fast and furious dry brushers. Now let's take care of the skin, using a trio of colors: topaz, tourmaline, and leopard stone. Using the three tones, I want to get a generic fair complexion, somewhere between Hobbs and Shaw. Starting with the darkest color, all of the skin got a base. This, unsurprisingly, took a few coats to get fully opaque. Then, mix in the next color at about 50-50, and start restricting your painting to the highlighted areas, then blending it in with the rest of the face. Once it looks good, move on to pure tourmaline and repeat the process, continuing down the line, painting smaller and smaller areas and blending it out until you land on a complexion you're looking for. About here is where it worked for me. For his eyes, I was feeling lazy. I mean creative. I wanted him to be moments away from blasting off another eye laser. So a quick basing of red and a tiny orange highlight led me to speed run those eyes. And I might as well paint those eyebrows before I forget them. Sliding up to his hair is simple enough. I just gave him a light dry brush of dark gray over the black primer. This will give just enough definition so you can see what his hair is doing without it looking gray. If you want, you can always give it a wash to redarken everything. I also used this same gray dry brush on the capacitors for the cables. Quick and easy. While the rest of the cable got night sky followed by Griffin highlight to match the other cables. And I finished them off by capping the exposed wires with a touch of greedy gold. After this, we can jump back into the spray booth the next day. Yeah, I know what I said about leaving the mask on, and I don't want to talk about it yet. Now, from the photos I've referenced, he has these gauntlets and boots that reflect his power level or output at the time. It's something I wouldn't know how to do with a brush, but switching to air power opens up a few doors for us. The first step is painting a background to lay an effect over. For this, I work my way up from red through orange to yellow. I'm trying to allow the volumes of the part to create some interesting shapes. Heck, I even toyed with the idea of using a loofah as a filter. It didn't really work the way I wanted to, but that's kind of the process. Figuring things out while in general pushing the brighter colors towards the fiery edge. I wish I can give you a more by the numbers explanation, but it's one of those feel things. The more you do it, the more you feel what's right, until it becomes second nature. Kind of like riding a bike. No one can explain riding a bike to someone to the point that they just know how to ride one. You gotta do it enough for you to understand what feels wrong and what feels right. Once you get confident in your ability to interpret those feelings, you relax into it and let intuition take over. And since I'm here, I loaded up some greedy gold to bling up the negative space of the S. One aspect of the Snyderverse I really appreciate was the tone choice of the suit. The desaturated tones invoke this feeling of legacy, so why not incorporate it here? Then, the next day, when I came back to everything, it was dry and time for some speckle effects, starting off with demonic yellow. To get tiny speckles from your gun, turn your PSI way down. I normally spray around 12 to 15 PSI and as high as 23 when I'm shooting thicker primers. But here, I'm shooting at only 4 PSI. Even at that low pressure, you only want to let go flicks of paint. The shorter your flick, the wider and more random your pattern. If you open it up too much, it'll start to sputter and look like splattered blood. Useful, but not on this model. This is also the same way you would apply distant stars on black for a space effect. But just one pass of speckles would not do, so I loaded up my brightest yellow, Arid. Just do your best to not overdo it, but have fun. It's not often speckles like this are useful in such an obvious way. Then came removing the mask, and this was a low point for me. You see, I'm able to paint and film in my free time, and sometimes that time gets broken up over several days, and when it comes to a project like this, almost 2 weeks. And yeah, I left the liquid mask on for over 3 days. And this is what happens. It dries out completely and becomes very hard to remove. Thankfully, I had applied copious amounts of varnish to protect the blue parts, so I was able to be very aggressive at removing it with a combination of toothpicks, Q-tips, IPA, and an old toothbrush. But even still, I was unable to remove the smaller bubbles. I just had to accept it and just did what I could. After banishing the rest of the mask off camera, the only thing left was to fill in the S with some thinned down gemstone red. It's over and finished, and so is this model. So I called it done. And damn, Gina, this came out great. Superman has never looked so full of angst. My dude definitely has some poems about darkness. Hell, he looks like he just came off the cover of Heavy Metal. If I would be honest with my critique, I probably would have went with a darker cape style, as this one ends up looking flat and out of place with everything else. Also, I should have realized that the cape was going to cover so much of the bat signal that I wouldn't have spent so much time getting that side pretty. But as for the seam in the back, it's definitely one of those you only see it because you know it's there. Overall, I really enjoyed this project, but no, it's more on the advanced side with such large pieces to print. But if you're up for the challenge, head over to this week's sponsor, SuperShark, to give it a try yourself. I'm gonna get working on my next project, so this is bye for now. But as always, thanks for watching, stay creative, and always enjoy the process.